The stench of rotting flesh, mingled with the perfume of French roses, hung in the thick air of the royal chamber, while two gaunt figures writhed on beds, separated by thousands of miles, yet bound by an equally macabre fate. It was the winter of 1547, and two of the most powerful men of Western Christendom convulsed in their final agony, their once magnificent bodies reduced to putrid husks of decadent power. Francis VIII of France and Henry VIII of England, eternal rivals, lovers of life, conquerors of territories and hearts, now shared only one terrifying certainty. Death watched them with the same cold, merciless eyes. 40 years earlier, when the world was still young and their ambitions boundless, Francis of Angoulême ascended the French throne as a Renaissance god made flesh. Tall, elegant, with golden hair that captured the light like strands of pure gold, he embodied everything France aspired to be. His blue eyes gleamed with a voracious intelligence that devoured art, literature, music, and women with equal fervor. A king born to rule heaven, whispered the courtiers at Fontainebleau, watching him glide with feline grace across halls draped in Italian silk and Persian carpets. The Venetian ambassador Marino Sanuto wrote in his chronicles, "His Majesty moves as if the earth itself is too small to contain his greatness. Every gesture is a work of art, every word a symphony." Francis collected artists as others collected jewels. Leonardo da Vinci died in his arms in Amboise, bequeathing him not only immortal works, but fragments of divine genius. On the other side of the English Channel, another giant awakened to his imperial destiny. Henry Tudor, eighth of his name, emerged from a gilded youth as a Norse Apollo. 6 feet 3 inches of sculpted muscle, red hair that flamed beneath the English sun, and a voice that echoed through Westminster's corridors with natural authority. Erasmus of Rotterdam, witness to his coronation, recorded, "Never have I beheld a creature so perfectly fashioned by Providence to lead men. His presence commands reverence without demanding submission. His intellect shines through eyes that seem to read souls as if they were open scrolls." Henry spoke 4 languages fluently, composed sacred music that made saints weep, and played tennis with the skill of a Roman gladiator. Theologians trembled before his doctrinal arguments. Seasoned diplomats found themselves lost in his relentless logic. The two titans met for the first time on the Field of the Cloth of Gold in June 1520, in an explosion of magnificence that outshone the sun. For 18 days, France and England engaged in an orgy of luxury so extravagant it depleted royal treasuries. Francis arrived in a golden silk pavilion that seemed woven by angels, surrounded by 300 nobles clad in velvet and ermine. Henry responded with a temporary palace of wood and glass that rivaled Versailles in splendor. They jousted, danced, feasted, and plotted under the watchful eyes of spies and chroniclers. Thomas Wolsey, the English cardinal, secretly wrote to the Pope, "I behold 2 demigods playing with mortal destinies. I fear that when their games cease, the world will bleed." The prophecy would prove eerily accurate. For 2 decades, they faced each other in a political chess game where pawns were armies and bishops were cardinals. Francis invaded Italy, like a modern Alexander, conquering Milan in a campaign that made poets compare him to Caesar. His victories echoed through Venetian cafes and Roman palaces. But at Pavia in 1525, the wheel of fortune turned with Shakespearean cruelty. Surrounded by Spanish imperial forces, his army shattered. Francis fought like a wounded lion until a lance pierced his gilded armor. The blood that stained the Lombard earth carried more than life. It carried the innocence of an era. "All is lost except honor," he wrote to his mother, Louise of Savoy, the words trembling on the page like tears of ink. Captivity in Madrid transformed the French Sun King into a spectral shadow. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, kept him in luxurious quarters that were gilded prisons. For interminable months, Francis withered away far from the gardens of Amboise, far from the laughter of his mistresses, far from the music that nourished his soul. His golden hair whitened prematurely, his elegant hands developed nervous tremors that never left him. The Florentine ambassador reported, "His Majesty seems to have aged a decade in each month of captivity. The eyes that once shone like sapphires now reflect only infinite melancholy." When he finally returned to France in 1526, he was a broken man disguised as a triumphant king. While Francis languished in a Spanish prison, Henry VIII began his own descent into personal hell. What began as a romantic passion for Anne Boleyn evolved into a destructive obsession that would shake the foundations of Christendom. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, was discarded like last season's gown, her silent suffering echoing through the dark corridors of Kimbolton Castle. "The king has become a ravenous beast," wrote Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, "devouring human lives as easily as he consumes roast swans." The schism with Rome was not merely religious. It was the first act of a tragedy that would consume Henry's soul like acid. Anne Boleyn, the bewitching French enchantress who hypnotized a king, discovered that seducing power was easier than controlling it. Her dark eyes, which once ignited royal passions, now reflected mounting terror as Henry transformed from lover into predator. She walked the corridors of Greenwich Palace like a gazelle, aware that the lion watched her, calculating the moment. Of the fatal pounce, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, recorded in his private diary, "I see His Majesty consumed by demons he himself invoked. Each day he becomes less man and more monster." Anne's execution in May 1536 marked not only the end of a life, but the death of the last vestige of humanity in the heart of the English king. Back in France, Francis desperately tried to rebuild not only his kingdom, but his own shattered identity. The palaces of Fontainebleau and Chambord once again filled with music and laughter, but the courtiers watched their monarch with growing unease. His hands trembled as he signed documents. His memory failed him during important audiences. Bouts of melancholy left him bedridden for days. Pierre de Bourdeille, known as Brantôme, wrote, "The king carries Pavia inside him like a wound that never heals. Sometimes during banquets, his eyes lose themselves in invisible distances, and we know that he is again walking the blood-soaked Lombard fields." The 1530s witnessed a parallel deterioration of the two monarchs, as if unseen forces orchestrated a macabre symphony of decay. Francis developed a persistent dry cough that echoed through the corridors of Amboise like a grim omen. His physicians, led by the famed Jean Fernel, applied leeches and administered purgatives that only hastened his decline. "His Majesty has wasted away alarmingly," reported the English ambassador Francis Bryan. "The cheeks once rosy now are dark hollows where death has taken up residence." The mistresses who once competed for his attention began to avoid his chambers, disturbed by the sweet, nauseating odor emanating from his body. Henry, in parallel, began his transformation from Adonis to Caliban. The athlete who once dominated, tournaments started to balloon grotesquely, his waist expanding like a balloon filled with vices and excesses. The 1536 tournament accident left him with a leg wound that never properly healed, a putrid ulcer that would fester for a decade, exhaling a stench so repugnant that courtiers fainted in his presence. Thomas Wriothesley, the royal secretary, discreetly noted, "The odor emanating from the king's leg is so intense that perfumers work day and night to mask the aroma of death that already inhabits His Majesty's body." The man who once danced like a Greek god now crawled through the palaces like an injured, raging bear. Paranoia grew in both like a metastatic cancer. Francis saw conspirators in every shadow at Fontainebleau, ordering arrests and executions with increasing frequency. The affair of the placards in 1534, when Protestants posted anti-Catholic pamphlets in Paris, unleashed a wave of terror that stained French streets with blood. "The king burns heretics as others burn wood," observed the Venetian ambassador Marco Foscari, but the fire consuming his enemies seems also to be devouring his own soul. Francis personally attended the executions, his glassy eyes reflecting the flames that consumed human bodies turned into living torches. Henry, for his part, turned the Tower of London into a royal slaughterhouse. Thomas More, his former friend and Chancellor, walked to the scaffold with a dignity that contrasted cruelly with the brutality of his executioner. The king, who once wrote treatises on theology, now rewrites the commandments to suit his convenience, More murmured minutes before his execution, his words echoing through the centuries as a prophetic curse. Thomas Cromwell, architect of the English Reformation, followed the same path in 1540. Discovering that serving a tyrant is like feeding a tiger human flesh. Sooner or later, the beast turns on its feeder. The 1540s witnessed a macabre acceleration in both kings' physical decline. Francis developed what his doctors called the French disease, probably syphilis contracted during his youthful escapades. The disease advanced mercilessly, corroding his sanity along with his body. Pustular ulcers covered his once alabaster skin. His hair fell out in greasy clumps, his teeth rotted in his mouth, exhaling a breath that made horses recoil. Diane de Poitiers, his longest-serving mistress, began to avoid his chambers, unable to bear the spectacle of human degradation he had become. Henry, now weighing over 300 pounds, moved through the royal palaces in a special chair, his moans of pain echoing through the corridors like the laments of a dying animal. The ulcer on his leg had become a gaping crater that required dressings, changed several times a day. Hans Holbein the Younger painted his last official portrait in 1543, but secretly destroyed the initial sketches. "Impossible to portray such degradation and maintain my faith in humanity," he confessed to his assistant. The king, who once personified the Renaissance ideal, had become a grotesque parody of power and mortality. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and last wife, arrived at court in 1543 as a real-life Florence Nightingale, determined to care for the monster her husband had become. Her private diaries, discovered centuries later, reveal the daily horror of living with a dying tyrant. "I wake each morning fearing he may have died in the night, yet fearing he has survived to endure another day of torment. His ulcers exhale, a perfume of death that no incense can mask. When he embraces me, I feel brittle bones beneath layers of putrid flesh. How can a man be simultaneously so alive and so dead?" In his final moments of lucidity, Francis dictated letters to his children with desperate urgency, as if he wanted to impart all his accumulated wisdom before madness claimed him completely. "Remember," he wrote to the Dauphin Henry, "that kings are mortal like beggars, and that power without humanity is merely tyranny adorned in gold." His hands trembled so badly he could barely hold the pen, ink blurred with tears, unspilled from a man who discovered too late that external conquests cannot fill internal voids. The winter of 1546 to 1547 arrived like an executioner clad in ice, bringing with it the inevitable end of two eras. Francis withered away at Château de Rambouillet, far from the glory of Fontainebleau, in an agony that stretched out like an earthly purgatory. His physicians applied mercury ointments that only hastened his deterioration. Priests whispered last sacraments that echoed in ears deaf from disease. "His Majesty seems already to dwell in the world of the dead," wrote Pierre de Ronsard, the royal poet, his eyes reflecting landscapes we, the living, cannot behold. At Hampton Court, Henry spent his final months in an atmosphere of suspended terror. Courtiers whispered in the corridors about familial curses and divine vengeance. The ulcer on his leg had rotted so badly that surgeons refused to examine it. The stench permeated carpets and curtains, turning royal chambers into mortuary cells. Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who had witnessed all the king's transformations, wrote prophetically, "I observe a man being devoured by his own appetites, like Saturn devouring his children. Death will not come as liberation, but as the culmination of a life that has become its own curse." Francis died on March 31st, 1547, on a grey dawn fitting for the end of a golden age. His final moments were a fevered delirium in which he relived Pavia repeatedly, barking orders to soldiers long dead. "Save France," were his last coherent words, whispered in a voice so faint it could barely bear the weight of so much regret. When he finally exhaled his last breath at 5 in the morning, those present reported that a strange peace descended upon his ravaged face, as if, at last, he had found the forgiveness he had vainly sought through 2 decades of torment. Henry followed him shortly after, expiring on January 28th, 1547, in an agony that lasted 3 interminable days. His last moments were haunted by the ghosts of his victims. Anne Boleyn appeared, dancing headless through the royal apartments. Thomas More recited excerpts from Utopia with bitter irony. Catherine of Aragon offered him a forgiveness he was incapable of accepting. "Why do they haunt me?" he cried to invisible shadows. "I did all for the good of England." When death finally claimed him on that frigid Thursday, those who witnessed his final moments swore that his final moans were not of physical pain, but of a soul confronting too late the magnitude of its own corruption. Both kings, on their deathbeds, face the same terrible revelation, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that external conquests can never atone for internal devastations. Francis, who dreamed of being a French patron of the arts, died, surrounded by masterpieces that could no longer touch him. Henry, who sought to reform Christendom, expired isolated from God and men. Their deaths were not only biological but symbolic, the end of an era in which kings fancied themselves demigods, only to discover, cruelly late, that they were merely men, robed in gold and purple. 16th century Europe lost, in that macabre winter of 1547, 2 of its most complex and contradictory protagonists, men who embodied both the best and worst of the Renaissance, who loved and hated with equal intensity, who built palaces and cemeteries with the same ruthless determination. Their terrible deaths were not accidents of fate, but inevitable consequences of lives lived beyond the limits of human moderation, as if existence itself collected, with compound interest of suffering, every excess committed in the name of greatness.